Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. Mahatma Gandhi, leader of the nonviolent movement that eventually ended British colonial rule in India, once said that I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. Well, many have shared this Hindu reformer's sentiment. It's one thing to reject Christianity and its theological claims. It's quite another to reject the person of Jesus. He's one of the most compelling characters in all of literature. Compassionate, fearless, a brilliant orator, lightning fast on his feet, yet uneducated by Roman standards, from the humblest of origins and showing the tendency of love for the least of his neighbors. When he claims divine titles for himself, and we are told performs miracles even, we're not inclined to treat him as a swindler. He strikes us as an unimpeachably good man, the opposite of a liar, the hero of the story of the New Testament. Yet, as C.S. Lewis points out, Jesus made claims that make it impossible for us to accept him as simply a good man. And if we're not prepared to call him insane or a liar, we must confront an altogether more startling possibility that he was and is who he said, Lord. Well, in this way, he is the ultimate paradox. Today, I welcome someone to the program who believes in confronting people with the person and the paradox of Jesus in all his fullness, so much that she's written a book on the subject. Rebecca McLaughlin is an apologist and author who will be familiar to those who've attended the Colson Center's annual Wilberforce Weekend Conference. She holds a PhD from Cambridge University and a theology degree from Oak Hill Seminary in London. She's the author of numerous books, including The Secular Creed, engaging 5 contemporary claims, and Confronting Christianity, 12 hard questions for the world's largest religion. Her latest is called Confronting Jesus, 9 encounters with the hero of the Gospels. And I welcome her today to the program to talk about that book. Rebecca, welcome to Upstream.
Thanks for having me.
What do you think it is about Jesus that sticks in our craw as a people, as a culture, as an overall civilization over centuries? Why do so many people just admire him, even if they don't accept the theological claims about him?
I think the problem with Jesus is that he always has us on our toes. We see this at every encounter he has in the Gospels. Every time he's asked a question, he doesn't answer it in quite the way that people would have expected. He usually kind of twists it around and gives a completely unexpected, more challenging response. And that was effective in the first century. I think it's also effective today. And I think Jesus, honestly, is as challenging to our non-Christian friends as he is to many of us who would identify as Christians, because his teachings leave all of us quite unsettled.
I just interviewed Glenn Scrivener about his new book. I think you guys have talked before on a podcast or two about his new book, The Air We Breathe, which kind of makes the case that we're all just very Christian in our moral sensibilities, right? Even if we don't know it and we call ourselves secular. And it's obvious that secular people aren't as disentangled from Christianity as they imagine. The sticking point seems to be the ethics of Jesus, that they can't give those up. How do you convince someone that they really do admire and depend upon Jesus' morals, even if they look at Christianity and they go, I don't want anything to do with this. This is repressive, medieval religion.
Yeah. What I find fascinating about that question is that a few years ago, when I was first starting to write on these issues, I became increasingly suspicious that we, whether we identify as Christians or not today, believe what we do morally essentially because of Christianity. So, for example, we believe that all human beings are fundamentally morally equal, that the strong and the rich and the powerful shouldn't trample on the poor and the weak and the marginalized, that men and women are equal, that there should be love across racial, cultural, national difference. All of these things which seem to us today to be self-evident truths, to coin a phrase, are in fact specific inheritances from Christianity. And what's been fascinating to me in the last few years is reading a number of books by non-Christians where they have come to that same conclusion. Because it's always easy to think, this is a Christian talking, of course she's going to claim that everything in Christianity, has set the agenda for the rest of the world. We all have a natural bias. But I think when you hear from atheist or agnostic historians and philosophers who are making the same claim, then at least my non-Christian friends sort of start to pay more attention. So one book I think of is Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari. And in that book, he makes no bones about the fact that things that we see as just sort of self-evident moral truths, like basic moral common sense, like human rights, are actually Christian beliefs. He says, for example, human beings, or Homo sapiens, as he puts it, have no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights. He says human rights are figments of our fertile imaginations. And he has this interesting comment on the Declaration of Independence, which famously said that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Harari says, the Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, but if we stop believing in God creating humans and souls and all that kind of thing, then what does it even mean to say that human beings are equal? He says that human rights and equality have embarrassingly little to do with a scientific study of Homo sapiens. So that's the perspective of someone who I believe identifies as atheist, certainly not theist in any way, who is almost sort of casual in his deconstruction of what many of our friends, whether they'd identify as Christian or not, would see as fundamental moral truths that you don't even need to defend because they're so obvious and so real, objective, universal. In fact, they depend on Christianity.
That raises an interesting possibility, Rebecca, with regard to the quote that I opened with Gandhi, right? So obviously this is a figure he comes out of a Hindu background, but is strongly influenced in many ways by Christianity. He kind of absorbs some Christian moral principles and uses them against the colonial occupiers of India. But I wonder if the appeal of Jesus could even be broader than the sort of historical influence that we receive as Christians. So obviously, Glenn and I talked a lot about the power of that residual historical influence, that we think like Christians, even if we don't call ourselves Christians, because those values are inculcated deeply in us, so much so that we think they're obvious. But what about a non-Western person or a non-Christian person who, say, comes from the background of Hinduism or Buddhism, or, obviously Islam is complicated because it's intertwined historically with Christianity, but some context that just is not Christian. Does Jesus have an appeal to those people? And if so, what does that intuitive appeal look like?
I think it depends who you are. So one of the most radical teachings of Jesus is his absolute priority of the poor, which again, to us, because we're so used to Christianity, feels like it's probably moral common sense that the poor should be cared for. But Jesus tells, terrifying parables, like the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where, he just sort of casually tells a story. There's a rich guy, there's a poor guy on his doorstep who's dying, or he's suffering, like having the dogs lick his wounds, living in miserable poverty. They both die. Rich man goes to hell, poor man goes to heaven. And then there's a conversation about it. And it's just almost sort of in passing, like, of course, the rich man went to hell. And it's not explicitly stated, but the strong implication is the rich man was absolutely failing in his duty toward the poor man, which he should have known from the Old Testament scriptures. But Jesus drives the nail in so much more deeply even than the Old Testament scriptures do, that how we treat the poor is a reflection on how we're treating Jesus himself. So for an ethical religious system like Hinduism, for example, which has a sort of explicit religious stratification of people, where the least and the poorest, the most marginalized are in that condition because that's kind of what they deserve, like that's where they belong. Christianity massively reverses that, which is, I think, why among Christians in India that actually it's the sort of lowest caste to whom Christianity has been the most attractive. So I think it sort of depends who you are and how good or bad the message of Christian ethics is going to be for you. What's fascinating to me, fascinating and unsettling actually, is that I think Christianity presents a deep and real challenge to pretty much every culture the world has ever generated, including cultures that have advertised themselves as Christian. So one striking example that I find today. I'm raising kids in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they go to the local public school, and people will sometimes say, it must be really hard to raise kids today in a cultural environment where Christian sexual ethics is seen as not only sort of foolish and ignorant, but actually kind of morally wrong. My kids lose close friends because they hold to Christian sexual ethics, and their friends think that they are morally beyond the pale. And I want to say, well, yes, there are challenges to raising kids in this environment. But actually, if we dial the clock back, and I imagine myself raising kids during segregation in America, I would be raising them in an equivalently anti-Christian culture, actually. I would be having to say to my kids, how so many people around us, including so many people who go to church, think that black people are inherently less valuable than white people. We don't believe that. I'd have to say to them, we need to cross over the segregation lines. Honestly, I think that would be a harder situation to be in with a more hostile environment to Christianity, even than we're facing now. So I think it's easy often to sort of romanticize our past and say, once upon a time, America, or in my case, same is true in England in somewhat different ways. Once upon a time, America was a Christian country. And then there was the 60s came, and there was the sexual revolution, and then the gay rights movement, and then abortion was legalized, and then the transgender rights movement, and sort of everything's gone horribly wrong since then. If we do that, we forget that actually it was only in the 60s that Black Americans were starting to have any measure of justice. So in fact, we can't look back to a sort of idealized Christian culture. It wasn't there. It was more wrong on some things than we are today, and perhaps more right on other things than we are. But in both cases, a place where Christians would need to really stand up against culture.
It makes me wonder whether the appeal of Christianity is not fully understood by secular or agnostic commentators. So you mentioned Tom Holland a couple of times in the book, real favorite of mine. I've had him on the show, really enjoyed his book, Dominion. But obviously he's not, or at least when I spoke with him, I don't know where he is now, but when I spoke with him, he wasn't fully in, he's not sort of invested in the Christian project as a factual description of history so much as an interesting observation of how morality evolved in the West. But I wonder, as Christians, if we can explain part of the power and appeal of this faith and Jesus himself with the fact that this is the true story of the world. If it is true that everyone has equal value in the eyes of God, if it is true that our imposed caste and class systems, our slavery, our segregation, our various ways of devaluing certain people and raising the value of others above them are artificial or anti-God or anti-creation, then it would make sense that a rabbi who comes along and restores the original created vision would have strong appeal to everyone, right? That people would realize and wake up and say, that's right. Of course, this is the truth that we forgot. What do you think about that? And what do you think about the intuitive appeal of Christianity? Or does it just does Jesus actually strike some people as revolting or subversive? Because I know that's a claim we hear from Greco-Roman history and so forth.
Yeah, I think Jesus is profoundly subversive. I find it fascinating, almost comic, to be honest, how in the Gospels, Jesus is repeatedly explaining to his followers that the first will be last. And the fact that he is the universal king of all doesn't mean that he's come to be served, but in fact that he's come to serve and give up his life as a ransom for many. In Jesus, we see that, the greatest king who ever could have lived, becoming not only being born poor, but actually dying a death that would have been mostly reserved for slaves as a ransom for us. So you see this massive sort of power reversal in the person of Jesus. And he keeps explaining to his followers, telling them he's going to die. And first Peter says, wait a minute, this can't be the plan. Definitely not. He starts trying to rebuke Jesus, and Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You're not thinking of the things of God, but think of things of men. Then you see James and John coming to Jesus and being like, could we have, in your new kingdom, could we have the left and the right seat to be your right hand and left hand man? Because they want status in the kingdom. Jesus is like, no. Status in my kingdom.
You got to get it right, Rebecca. It wasn't them. It was their mom.
Well, it was sort
him.
of, depending on both together, all three together.
That's right.
So you have his three closest disciples, all of them don't get it. And then you have, Jesus explains to his disciples that he's going to die, and they start arguing about which of them is greatest. You can imagine Jesus like tearing his hair out. But even his closest, physical followers could not wrap their minds around the fact that status in Jesus' kingdom just doesn't work like we would want status to work, or we expect status to work. And I think similarly today, Christian ethics is both very attractive and also profoundly unsettling to us, because we are so primed to want to kind of chisel our way up to the top and to push others down, that it's almost like, I always forget, what do you call those dolls that you sort of push them down and they pop up again? They're like weighted in such a way, sort of topsy-turvy or whatever.
They're like punching bags. I had one when I was a kid. It was shaped like a dinosaur. It was like a little T-Rex that you'd punch him and then he would come right back at you.
Or a punching bag. Yeah, maybe it's dolls or punching bags. And it's like Jesus sort of trying to persuade them and tell them that they need to seek the lowest place in order to be great in his kingdom. And they just kind of come popping up as soon as he kind of lets go for a second. That is so intrinsic to our human nature, that whereas I can laugh at it in the apostles, I can also see it in myself.
Yeah. Rebecca, one of the things that really put your book over, I'll just kind of tell you how the sausage is made here. In my, reading list and inviting people on the podcast, was the focus you have on stories. This is really interesting to me. So the book is sort of billed as 9 encounters with the hero of the gospel. So the gospels are stories or biographies, and Jesus comes to us as the hero. But Jesus really isn't the only hero in your book. You refer throughout to plays and literature and movies and TV shows and all kinds of heroes from all sorts of fictional portrayals to illustrate the heroic properties of Christ. How did you get that idea? And who do you think that sort of style appeals to?
I strongly believe, and this is true of both speaking and of writing, that if you are not fighting for your audience's attention, you don't have it. And one of the ways in which you fight for your audience's attention is by making them work, which is a little bit counterintuitive, because we sometimes think, my job is to make things easy for my audience. It's actually not. It's to make things the right kind of hard. So what I try to do when I'm speaking or writing is to weave between different kinds of illustration that are forcing my reader to do the work of comparing A with B and thinking about what's similar, what's different. I opened this book with an illustration from Hamilton, which, super fun musical. I'm not really into musicals in general, but I went to see it as the first outing after I had my third child. It was like Luke was born in August. We went in November with my best friend and her husband. And what's fascinating about Hamilton, amongst other things, is that he's gone from being, basically unknown, or at least certainly I hadn't heard of Hamilton, truth be told. I'm sure you're far more up on American history than I ever was.
You mean the figure, the actual historical figure? Yeah.
Like prior to Hamilton, the musical.
Right.
People's knowledge of Hamilton was at best flimsy, right? Maybe you know the name, not a whole lot more. Now he's become one of the most well-known of the founding fathers. But my 12-year-old just read this massive 800-page biography of Hamilton, which I think Lin-Manuel Miranda based, some of his ideas for the musical on. And she kept coming to me as she was reading this book. She was like, "Mum, Hamilton in real life is so much worse than Hamilton in the musical. He's just not a good man in so many different ways." So the more you scratch the surface, the more you actually find out about Alexander Hamilton, the less of a hero he becomes. With Jesus, it's actually the other way around. The more I read the Gospels, the more impressed I am with Jesus. And I think the role that story plays in the Gospels is so important, because we don't only see Jesus sort of teaching in a kind of disembodied way. We see him teaching particular people and in particular contexts and conversations and relationships. And there's so much that we learn from not just from Jesus's words, but actually from how his words relate to his actions in the Gospels. So I think the Gospels bring it all together, and I think we should too.
So I want to dive into the 9 encounters here, because there's so much great content there. But before we do, I want to ask you what your basic 1-minute defense of the Gospels as historical narrative is for those who are skeptical. So you sit down with a lot of skeptical-minded people to defend, the Christian faith. And so the Gospels are the source material for all of this book. And yet there are many people who would look at the Gospels and say, that's just invented fables. It's sort of stories told after the fact. It doesn't represent the historical Jesus, who we really can't know much about. What would you say to that person in defense of using the Gospels to learn about him?
Yeah. So here's my elevator pitch for 4 points. Number one, the Gospels are early. So Mark's Gospel, the first to be written down, was experts, even non-Christian experts, would place it between 35 and 45 years after the events that it records. Some even earlier actually, but that's a conservative estimate that many non-Christian historians would affirm, which means that the Gospels were written well within the lifetime of eyewitnesses of Jesus's life, death, and claimed resurrection. For comparison, the Roman Emperor Claudius, whose biographies were written by Tacitus and Suetonius, they were writing very likely 60 plus years after Claudius's death. So especially in ancient historical terms, very early.
And your eyewitnesses are drying up at that point.
Yeah. So number two, the Gospels are eyewitnessed. And we see in the Gospels, it's fascinating, a British historian named Richard Borkham, who wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, where he's arguing from comparing the Gospels with other ancient sort of bios documents, biographies, that when the Gospel authors give us specific names of people, they're pointing us to eyewitness sources for what they're saying. So many folks in the Gospels are anonymous, but when you come across names, it's often because the Gospel author is saying, I got this from Mary Magdalene or whichever of the eyewitnesses it was. So the Gospels are early. The Gospels are eyewitnessed. Number three, and I find this kind of amusing, the Gospels are really embarrassing. So people sometimes say, well, the Gospels were probably made up or like at least massaged by the early Christian leaders because they wanted to promote a particular view of Jesus. If you look at the portrayal of the apostles in general and Peter in particular in the Gospels, you find people who Jesus refers to, like his nickname for them is "You of little faith." You see Peter, as I mentioned earlier, being called Satan by Jesus. You see him swearing that he will die with Jesus if he needs to, and then hours later denying that he even knows him 3 times. If anybody had the political power to influence the stories that were written about Jesus after his death, it was Peter. He's central leader of the first century church. And yet, even in Mark's Gospel, which we think is based on Peter's memories in particular, we see this very embarrassing portrayal of Peter and the other apostles. We also see, another kind of embarrassing angle, we see the prominent role of women in the Gospels in general and in the resurrection accounts in particular. And if you were writing for a first century audience, the last thing you would do is make a kind of unbelievable claim like this guy rose from the dead and then hang it on the testimony of women. That would be like saying, well, a bunch of kids saw it, and so it must be true. Like today we would just say, yeah, but they're kids. Kids think they see things, right? Like that is the posture that the educated Greco-Roman man would have had toward the testimony of women. And yet, very embarrassingly, all 4 Gospels say that women are the first witnesses of the resurrection. So the Gospels are early, the Gospels are eyewitness, the Gospels are embarrassing. And finally, the Gospels are everywhere. And the point here is that people sometimes sort of think that, once upon a time, these 4 guys wrote down their Gospel accounts. And then, over many generations of copying, like the message was just lost along the way, a bit like the telephone game where you whisper into somebody's ear a message and then it gets past the next person. It gets more and more corrupted as you go on. Now, if we only had one bloodline, as it were, of the Gospels, so one copy, there was then another copy was made of that copy, another copy was made of that copy, and we're only depending on sort of an individual genealogical chain from each Gospel, then yes, we could expect changes and errors to happen over time. And we might think, well, maybe we have something that's not that reliable. But what happened was the early Christian movement spread extremely quickly in all sorts of directions. And so the Gospels were being copied independently of each other all over the world. And what that means is now we have a very large number of early copies of the Gospels, and we can compare between them to see where any little errors have crept in. And what that means is that actually the text that you and I have in our Bibles today, translated from the Greek, of course, if you can be bothered to learn New Testament Greek, as I have, somewhat bothered when I was in seminary, and it's very rusty now, we have access to those documents. And actually, we can be sure, very confident about the vast, vast majority of what we find in the Gospels. There are only 2 substantial texts in any of the Gospels that are in doubt. And in your Bibles, it will say, we're not sure if this, first chunk of John 8 or this last chunk of Mark 16, we think this isn't in the earliest documents we have, and we think they may have been added later. Otherwise, we can actually be very confident. And actually, the places where there is any doubt about the text, none of them are places that would substantially change the picture of Jesus in the Gospels that we are presented with.
I think it was Bart Ehrman that you quote in the book, who basically just comes out and says the Gospels are the earliest usable witness for the life and times of Jesus, without contest.
Yes, and that this is believed by both evangelical Christians and atheists. And experts across the sort of faith spectrum would agree with this. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's get into the 9 encounters here. The first is obviously an essential prerequisite for who Jesus is, and that is that Jesus is a Jew. We encounter him as a Jew. Why is it meaningful and important that Jesus doesn't come to us as this kind of generalized figure that speaks to the whole secular world of the time? He's not a Greek philosopher. He is from a very parochial place and a time and a culture and a people who are by no means powerful or widespread. Why not another nationality? Like Christopher Hitchens has said that, Jesus, if he was smart, God would have come to earth in imperial China or something like that, not in this backwater of the Roman Empire and this oppressed people. So why a Jew? Why do we meet him that way?
Yeah, so on the one hand, as you pointed out, Jesus is born in really a backwater of the Roman Empire. He was born in Bethlehem, but his sort of hometown, Nazareth, was very unimpressive, even within the sort of Jewish territory. So on the one hand, you could say, well, Jesus was born poor and obscure, and it's completely extraordinary that a man who was born into those circumstances, who never wrote a book, ruled an empire, or raised an army, is now the most famous and influential human being in history. Like, that's extraordinary. But I think the significance of Jesus being Jewish goes much deeper than that. Because, of course, from a biblical perspective, God revealed himself in particular to the Jews. And one of the fundamental differences between the Jews and all their pagan neighbors was that they believed that there was only one true God. And that this one true God was the creator God of all the universe. And that would have seemed like a completely outrageous and probably somewhat laughable claim at the time. So for us today, for me in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 2022, people might laugh at the idea that I believe that there is a God who made the universe. And they might think that not believing in God at all is actually the much more sort of socially acceptable thing. But in the first century, the idea that there is only one God, and that this isn't just like one little tribal God among many, but actually there is only one God who made the heavens and the earth and who is actually creator and ruler of all the world, was completely bizarre. But that is what Jesus stepped into. So what would have looked like an extreme minority report in the first century has now become actually the majority report of most of the world today, who would believe that there is only one creator God. And it's because of Jesus.
In light of Jesus' Jewishness, and this is a question I kind of personally wrestle with, so I'd love to hear your personal thoughts on this. In light of his Jewishness, and the fact that he is stepping into a story that is very much in progress, speaking to a people very much having a history and riffing off of that history. What is the legitimacy of pointing people who do not know Christianity to the Gospels first and saying, hey, step into this conversation in its like 9th or 10th hour of progress, as opposed to going to, say, Genesis and learning the whole Jewish story? What do you think the legitimacy of that is, the usefulness of that?
Yeah, what I would tend to do is start with the Gospels, but to help people understand the Gospels, which I think can only be done in the context of the story of the Bible as a whole. And the reason I would unashamedly start with the Gospels is because my belief in Christianity as a whole and my belief in the Bible as a whole is actually entirely founded on Jesus himself. The Old Testament is, I could see it as a fascinating historical and literary document. But if Jesus is not who he says he is, then my confidence in the Bible as a whole has completely, like a hole has been blown in its side. I would say start with Jesus, but situate Jesus as the Gospels do in the context of the story of God's people from the beginning. And we actually aren't going to understand the things that Jesus is teaching in the Gospels if we don't do that.
Right. I think of, the fact that we are, most of us, Gentile readers in Jesus' terms, in the terms of him and his followers. So we're being invited into the story from the outside. We're hearing references to Elijah and Abraham and Moses and, Noah and all these figures. And it's just like, what is this? What is this story? Where does this come from? Why should I care? And Jesus sort of just assumes that his audience will care about this. But I agree that Jesus himself is a compelling figure, so much so that you can point someone to him and say, meet him. And then you will realize why all the other people earlier in that history, in his own genealogy, for instance, matter. And, it works. And that to me is part of like the supernatural testimony of Scripture itself, that it has the power to affect people, even when all they've read is the Gospel of John, right? You give them that little tiny booklet that they hand out at parades and stuff. And people read that and it changes lives. It legitimately does. It happens all the time. I want to move on to the second one, Jesus as Son. And I want to raise this question because I think a lot of people will be thinking this if they are unbelievers. Is it possible to read the Gospels as someone who takes Jesus to be just a good moral teacher? Because you make the claim that he is all throughout these accounts dropping hints and using phrases that say, I am someone much more than just a carpenter's son from Nazareth. But how easy is it to read the Gospels while ignoring those claims? Or is it even possible?
I don't think it's possible, to be honest. If you want to, you have to be like, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, who went through the Bible and sort of physically cut out the parts that he didn't like. And I guess you could do that. It wouldn't achieve much, and it certainly wouldn't be.
They sell those. When I visited Monticello, his house, in the little gift shop there, they've got Jefferson Bibles, and they're a lot smaller than a regular Bible.
Well, funny that is, the most horrific heresy. People who think that Jesus never claimed to be God, I think, sadly, have not actually read any of the gospel accounts of his life, because it's woven throughout the text. One of the examples that I love is when, famously, a paralyzed man is lowered down through the roof of the building where Jesus is teaching in front of Jesus. And clearly the intent of his friends is that this man would be healed. And Jesus looks at him and says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And you can imagine the paralyzed man is probably thinking, well, okay, thanks. That's not really why I came here. I came because my legs don't work. And his friends are probably perplexed by that. But the religious leaders around Jesus are horrified because they're saying, who can forgive sins but God himself? This man is actually blaspheming because he is taking on himself the role of forgiving sins. And it's not, you and I can forgive somebody's offenses against us, and hopefully we frequently do. But we have absolutely no right to sort of pronounce forgiveness over somebody for all their offenses against God and against everybody else. So we're not in that place. And then we have my favorite kind of ... in the whole Bible, where Jesus says, he says, which is easier, to say to the paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and walk? And on the one hand, the answer is, well, it's easier to say your sins are forgiven, because you couldn't prove that that's happened or not. Like I could stand up and say, somebody's sins are forgiven, and I could save face because nobody can see that happening. In fact, for Jesus, it is far harder to say your sins are forgiven than to say get up and walk. He can heal this man with just his words. But for forgiveness, Jesus had to give his life. And then he says, but that you may know that the Son of Man, his favorite way of talking about himself, has authority on earth to forgive sins. I say to you, I say to you, get up and walk. And the man gets up. And so we have this, shocking claim that we only understand if we kind of hear with the ears of the first century Jews, that Jesus is claiming that he has the right to forgive sins. But we also see, Jesus standing up one day in the middle of a storm and telling the wind and the waves to stop. And they do. And I believe it's in Mark's gospel, where the particular way that Mark describes it, he says that the disciples are very much afraid in the midst of the storm. And they wake Jesus up, he's asleep, and say, Master, don't you care that we're perishing? And Jesus stands up and calms the storm. And you would expect them to be thinking, oh, well, phew, that was great relief on the part of the disciples because they're not going to die. And instead, Mark says that they were filled with a great fear. And they said to one another, who is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? Now, there's just two examples of many in the Gospels where Jesus shows that he has an authority far beyond what any mere human has. And we see that, people sometimes say, well, John's Gospel was written last, and that's the one where Jesus makes all these massive kind of I am statements, channeling the name of God from the Old Testament and making these sort of grandiose claims about himself. But if you look at the earlier Gospels, it's easier to see Jesus just as a human, very impressive human rabbi. Actually, I just don't think that washes. You can read Mark's Gospel, the very first one to be written down, and you see evidence of Jesus' divinity throughout.
And the reaction of his listeners, too, is instructive. And we don't often get this because we don't have those Jewish ears. So we're not hearing the claims the same way they are, like the claim to forgive sins, for instance, or the claim that in Capernaum where he stands up and reads the Isaiah scroll in the synagogue and he says, this day, this prophecy is fulfilled before you. He's claiming the messianic mantle in that. And their reaction is always, you're a blasphemer. You have a devil. We're going to stone you, right? Because you are committing the highest act of blasphemy and denial of the first and second commandments, which is that there's only one God, and you're claiming to be equal with him. And in fact, you see the phrasing of this man has made himself equal with God and things like that. We don't get that because we're just so used to, he's forgiven sins. What a swell guy. You can't forgive sins, and it's not something any of the prophets do. Even the way he speaks, I forget which gospel it is, but someone notes that this man speaks as one who has authority.
And not like the scribes, yeah.
Yeah, not like the scribes. So instead of saying, even like a prophet would, thus saith the Lord, he doesn't come and say that. I don't think Jesus ever says anything approximating, thus saith the Lord. He just says it as a declarative statement, as if he has authority. And that reaction to that is something we have to have the ears and the eyes to pick up, because those who had first encountered him certainly were picking it up.
One of my favorite stories in all the Gospels, and I am almost incapable of writing a book without writing about John chapter 11. So, spoiler alert for anyone who wants to read any of my books. We're going to be going to John 11, where the headline news of the chapter is that Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. That's sort of what's most famous about it. But in fact, what's most moving and stunning to me is the conversation he has with Lazarus' sister Martha. Martha and Mary at the beginning of the chapter have sent for Jesus because Lazarus is sick, and he hasn't come on purpose. And John is very clear in verse 5. He says that Jesus loved Mary and Martha and their brother, and yet he stayed where he was. He didn't come. He deliberately waits until Lazarus is dead, and then he finally goes. And Martha comes out to meet him. She says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, he will give you. It's extraordinary faith she has. Like, her brother's dead and she still thinks Jesus can heal him. Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And she thinks he's talking about the Jewish belief in resurrection at the last judgment day, when God's faithful people would finally be raised. And so she says, I know he will rise again at the resurrection on the last day. And then Jesus looks into this grieving woman's eyes and he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, will live. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Now that claim, even if you don't understand the Old Testament context of Jesus saying, I am, and channeling the covenant name of God, which was so sacred that Jesus wouldn't even say it, even setting that aside, the fact that he claims that he is the resurrection and the life, and that being alive means believing in him, and being dead means not believing in him. Whether or not you're physically alive or dead, the real difference is whether you're trusting in Jesus or not. That is either a legitimate claim to divinity, or it is megalomania, the most abhorrent narcissism. As we see Jesus setting his sights on the cross, it's pretty obvious he's not a narcissist. He's in fact the man most willing to sacrifice himself for the least of us. And yet he makes this outrageous claim, which he then goes on to prove or support by raising Lazarus from the dead. But we see that conversation first, and then we even see him weeping with Lazarus' sisters at Lazarus' tomb. It's an extraordinary chapter, and one of many where we see Jesus wielding his divinity in the most tender, loving way, but being extraordinarily clear about it.
So this human figure who claims to be divine comes to us as well with another claim, which is your third encounter, and that is Jesus as king. What do the Gospels say about this? How do we know they are legitimate in this claim to royalty? And then what does that mean, and why should we care? You talk about how we're all democratic. We don't want a king, right? What does this claim to kingship mean?
Yeah, it's something that we easily miss in the Gospels, actually, and even in Jesus's title. So most people will know that Jesus' sort of other name is Christ, Jesus Christ. But I think a lot of people in our culture today think it's just sort of like his last name or something. They don't really know what Christ means. And what it means is it's sort of the Greek version of the Hebrew word from which we get the word Messiah. And it's claiming that Jesus is the rescuing king who God had been promising through his prophets for centuries that he would send. And so Jesus's kingship is very clear throughout the Gospels. The very first verse of Mark's Gospel says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And we see that claim emerging in the course of the gospel. So, for example, in Mark 8, Jesus specifically affirms that he is the Christ. And it's the charge against Jesus when he dies, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So it's sort of prominent in the Gospels. But I think we are inclined to miss it today, partly because we're not desperately waiting for a Messiah to come and rescue us like God's people were in the first century. Partly because actually out of the seedbed of Christianity, democracy has sprung, because we've sort of realized human beings are actually we're so corrupt that you're better to share power among as many people as possible rather than to let one person have it, because no one person actually has the moral character and the wisdom to rule, except that Jesus does. And at the end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus says to his disciples, all authority in heaven and on earth is given to me, and therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and the Spirit. Famously, the Great Commission we see as the mandate to share the gospel with people from every tribe and tongue and nation, which it is. But I think we're inclined to miss how Jesus begins that sentence, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. I am the king, not just of the Jews, but actually the king of all the world. So go and let people know and invite them into my kingdom is essentially what that message is. And even the word gospel, which in our ears sounds primarily like a religious term for the message of Jesus, in its first century context would have been more associated with like a kind of political proclamation of a new emperor saying, great news, the emperor is, so-and-so has become emperor, or great news, your tribes have been conquered and you're now a part of the Roman Empire. It's a sort of declaration of victory, actually. And so I think we need to recognize Jesus as king today, which means he's king of all the world, and it means that he's king of you and me. He's not just like a sort of optional extra in our lives or someone with whom we have a very special relationship, which hopefully we do. He's actually also our king, and we kind of need to treat him that way.
What does that mean in political terms? And that's kind of a controversial question, because we're often told that Christians as participants in the polis cannot insist on legislating morality, right? We have to kind of leave our faith behind in a way. What does it mean to confess that Jesus is king? And does that include kind of earthly governments?
Yeah, the fact is, all legislation is legislating morality one way or another. And so we can't say that, well, Christians or even religious people in general need to leave their faith commitments behind, because actually that's where our morality comes from. Now, two things that I want to nuance. Number one is, there are a lot of things that are legitimately required of Christians that I do not think should be legally required of non-believers. For example, I think Christians are essentially required to go to church every week, unless there's a global pandemic. It's vital. Christians are required to give to the poor. Christians are required to pray. The things that Christians must do. Christians are required to live according to Christian sexual ethics. Now, many of these things are not things that I think should be legally imposed on non-believers, not because they're not good and right and true, but because they're actually things that flow out of discipleship rather than needing to sort of precede discipleship. So I think, it's true that we should bring our Christian commitments into the public square as we debate politics. We shouldn't expect non-Christians to live according to Christian ethics. Christian ethics will actually, and I say this as someone who sort of stepped into the American political world about 14 years ago, sort of immigrant from the UK. And
then you went to Broadway to learn our history. It was
right.
So studious of you.
Yeah, read some books as well. But what perplexed me when I first came to America was the fact that it seemed like appeals to Christian ethics were sort of sprinkled in all directions in the American political world, but not in any very kind of coherent way. And I think there are some, historic reasons for that. But I think as Christians, we should be known, for example, for our commitment to the poor. And any political party that doesn't want to tell me what they are doing to care for the poor, I have very little interest in what else they have to say. We should be known as those who protect the most vulnerable. So that includes unborn babies who deserve our protection, and it includes impoverished mothers who more often than not are pressured toward abortion or end up having an abortion because they don't feel like they'll get the support that they need. I think as Christians, we have a profound commitment to both sort of parties in that equation. It means I don't think the Bible is prescriptive on every point of sort of political policy. So, for example, I would be very open to different political parties telling me about their different strategies for serving the poor. I don't have a particular kind of commitment to one policy or strategy versus another, but that needs to be a driving force behind any, legitimately Christian policy. Christians should be known for love across racial difference. Actually, racial diversity and love and equality is something that was Christian from the first. And the fact that Christians in the history of the US and in important ways in the history of the UK as well have not been known for that, and in fact often have been known for the reverse, is a profound stain of sin. But the fix for that is not less Christianity, it's actually more. The problem with the segregationists was not that they were too Christian, it was that they weren't half Christian enough. It wasn't they were reading their Bibles too carefully, it was that they were absolutely desecrating the scriptures. People sometimes say, oh, you don't really fit into any political box. I'm like, well, the scriptures don't allow me to, as far as I can tell. Which is not to say, I respect people who do, but I think whichever political party we choose, we need to be people who are challenging that party on the ways in which it is failing to live up to Christian ethics, actually.
So we've got 10 minutes left, and obviously we're not going to get to the whole book here. And I seldom do with my guests because we just love to discuss so deeply about each chapter. But I'm going to let you pick in a second kind of the chapter that you want to close us out with, because there's a lot of good stuff here. I'll name all the remaining chapters, but I want to skip to number 5 real quick, because this one struck me as particularly relevant and challenging. It's Jesus the teacher, and it flows from the point that you just made, that Jesus has a challenge for everybody. He doesn't seem to fit well into a box. If you listen to Jesus as a sort of conventional right-winger in American politics, you'll hear him placing way too much of an accent on the wickedness of the rich and the exploitation they often engage in with the, against the poor, and how that he values the poor and wants to lift them up and so forth. And he just puts too much emphasis on that. But he's good on sexual ethics, right? We want to be nice and tight and well regulated on that front morally. If you're from the left, you're going to be thinking the opposite. You're like, oh yeah, I love all that stuff about social justice and the poor and the downtrodden. Not so keen on this really strict sexual teaching that he's laying down. So talk to us about Jesus, the teacher. What does he give us? What stands out? How does he depart from or change the teaching that would have been familiar to his listeners? And how does his teaching challenge us today?
His teaching flows profoundly out of the Old Testament scriptures. So on one level, faithful Jews of Jesus' day should have been receiving Jesus as, literally the answer to their prayers. Now, of course, he digs in even more deeply and is Messiah that God's people needed, but not that they would necessarily have expected. So I'm not saying that everything about Jesus is sort of entirely predictable.
That almost sounded like a Batman quote there. He's
right.
He's the Messiah we deserve, just not the one we need right now.
the other way around. He's the Messiah we need and don't deserve.
Exactly.
So there's a profound continuity between Jesus' teaching and Old Testament ethics. Interestingly, when it comes to sexual ethics, Jesus actually tightens up the Old Testament. He tightens up what the Old Testament says about divorce, for example, and says, what God has brought together, let not man tear asunder. In a culture which at that time had made divorce actually much easier than it ever should have been. And that the people who really suffered from that were women, who were often divorced and sort of cast aside without provision. Women and children suffered from that. So we see this sort of profound continuity between what Jesus teaches and what we hear of God's heart in the Old Testament. But where the Old Testament says, don't commit murder, Jesus says, if you're angry in your heart at your brother, you've already committed murder. Where the Old Testament said, don't commit adultery, Jesus says, if you've looked at a woman lustfully, bad news, you've already committed adultery. Tightens up and cuts deeper when it comes to both sexual ethics and our whole posture toward others. When he's asked what the greatest commandment is, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And when he's asked, who is my neighbor? He tells a story of love for somebody who the hero in the story would have been raised to hate. We find it hard to even get our heads around the story of the Good Samaritan in the right way because we weren't raised to hate Samaritans. In fact, if anything, we associate Samaritans with goodness. If we know anything about Samaritans, we know they're good.
Yeah, right. It's completely reversed in our mind.
For Jesus' day, no. The Samaritans are definitely the bad guys. They are the sort of racial and religious outsiders, morally corrupt, and all the bad things.
I like the example you gave. You said, it's as if Jesus told the parable in the Jim Crow South to a bunch of white audience that the hero of the story who helps the one in need is a black man, right? This wouldn't have gone over super well.
Yeah. He reverses the expectations and radically expand the category of who our neighbor is to where we are called not just to love people like us, not just to love our friends, our family, but actually to love our enemies. And that has had profound ethical implications through the centuries ever since, and is profoundly challenging to us even today as we think about, what does it mean for us to love, say, our ideological enemies, for instance. I think in our cultural moment, it's very important that we fight for the truth of the gospel, but that we only fight with Jesus' weapons. And the weapons Jesus gives us are love and prayer and humility and self-sacrifice. It's tempting, I think, for us to feel like we're on the back foot culturally and to think, well, what we need to do is sort of fight back with the same weapons that might be used against us. And both the example and the teachings of Jesus tell us that's completely wrong. We actually need to fight with the opposite weapons. We need to fight with Jesus' love.
So the remaining encounters that we haven't dealt with are Jesus the healer, Jesus the lover, Jesus the servant, Jesus the sacrifice, and Jesus the Lord. If you could pick one of those that you just really love and think we ought to end this thing on, what would it be?
I'm going to pick Jesus the lover, not because the others aren't extremely important, but because that's the one that I think is often least well understood. Because we tend to think that our conversations about sexual ethics are ones that can be had sort of separate from the gospel itself. And in fact, I think that they are fundamentally about the gospel. And this is why. In the Old Testament, we see this repeated metaphor of God as a loving, faithful husband and Israel as his often unfaithful wife. We then see Jesus in the Gospels sort of stepping onto the stage of human history and declaring that he is the bridegroom. It's one of the ways in which he steps into the shoes of Yahweh in the Old Testament. And we see the Apostle Paul explaining that Christian marriage is like a little scale model of Jesus' love for his church. And we see in Revelation, the end of the Bible, this massive shout going up, the wedding of the Lamb has come. And we see Jesus' marriage to his church bringing heaven and earth back together. So we have this massive wall print-sized picture of God's love for his people, Jesus' love for his church, which is what human marriage is ultimately about. And both within the church and outside the church, we've missed that. Too often as Christians, we've acted like human marriage is the destination, when in fact it's just the signpost. And we've thought it's marriage first, and anyone who doesn't get married is sort of, it's at best disappointing, right? Like the call of every good Christian man or woman is to get married and have children. They're wonderful things. I'm married with children, and they're both great blessings. But curiously, the New Testament seems to present singleness as even better than marriage. And the reason is that the marriage is not the destination. It's not what it's all about. Actually, relationship with Jesus is what it's all about. And so that helps us understand what marriage is and what singleness is, and what the point of our lives are at all. That in the absolute best human relationship, we will get a glimpse, like a little echo of Jesus's love for us, what that looks like. And it also helps explain why it is that Christians have a very specific vision for sex and romance, and how that vision is of one man and one woman joined together irreparably in marriage. And that's because it's about Jesus and the church. And again, I think too often we've, in our conversations both inside and outside the church, we've lost that big picture when we're talking about Christian sexual ethics. And we made it about something else, when in fact it's fundamentally about marriage as a picture of Jesus' love for us. And I think it changes how we enter into marriage, how we think about marriage, how we think about sex and romance more broadly. It changes as well, if we read the New Testament, it changes how we think about friendship between people of the same sex. Because it's not actually the case that the Bible doesn't affirm love between people of the same sex. It actually does. But it's a different vision. Like friendship gives us a different angle on God's love than marriage does. Just as the father-child relationship gives us a different angle on God's love for us than the husband-wife relationship. And we have massively undervalued friendship, which to where when Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends, we would in most church settings have ended the sentence differently. We would have said, greater love has no one than this, than the love of a husband for his wife, or maybe the love of a mother for her child. But Jesus says, no, greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And I think we would live much more richly in Christian community, and we would witness much better to the world if we actually lived into Christian community ethics like that.
Rebecca, what do you find is the most common sort of sticking point or objection at the moment when someone has encountered the Jesus of the Gospels, has read, this book, and then gone and actually delved into the Gospels, and comes to you and sits down over coffee and says, I like this Jesus character. Just like Gandhi said, I like him a lot, but I'm not ready to go the sort of full Monty on Christianity yet. What is the sticking point that you find people come back to again and again, or most often today? And what do you say to them?
Right now, there are two people who I think of who are more or less in that category. And interestingly, for both of them, they would actually kind of like to believe, or that's what they've told me, but that they feel like they just don't, that they haven't sort of received the gift of faith, which in some theological terms makes sense. Of course, like God, we need God to open people's eyes. And that's what I'm praying for them. In one instance, it's a young woman who actually met because we were giving out little Christmas gifts in our neighborhood, including, I wrote a short book about Christmas called Is Christmas Unbelievable that came out for last Christmas. And I thought, this is a book designed to be given out at churches or in neighborhoods. And so I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. And our family went around our neighborhood and just knocked on people's doors. Here are some chocolates and a little book and an invitation to a carol service. And on the way, on our first sort of little mission to do this around our neighborhood, my 9-year-old asked me, Mummy, how many people would it be worth it for us to do all of this? Like, how many people coming to the carol service would it be worth it? And I said, just one. And after that first little circuit, one of the doors we'd knocked on, they hadn't been in, we left the parcel, emailed the email address I'd given and said she'd love to come to the carol service. And so this young woman has joined our community group, has been reading the Bible with us. And she said to me that she had been praying, prior to this. She was like, she had asked God to just make himself obvious to her. She'd been raised Jewish. She'd sort of become dissatisfied with that. She'd felt like she'd started to look into Christianity, but she just didn't know what she believed. I said to her, well, I hope, a random English woman knocking on your door in Cambridge, Massachusetts, of all places, and like inviting you to church. I hope that's God making himself obvious. But yeah, she's someone who I think would like to believe. And I'm praying that the Lord will open her eyes. But it's not so much a question as a situation.
That's fascinating. Well, it brings us back to, in my mind, just speaking personally, to the continued duty and honor we have as Christians of speaking to this Jesus. You know, we analyze him sort of through the text as a historical figure, and we may even gladly worship the figure we meet in the text of Scripture. But this Jesus is alive and reigning now, and hears our prayers and encourages us to seek his help and the power that was available to the disciples. You know, we're told again and again is available to us in spades. In fact, that we have the capacity to do greater things even, which is mind-boggling to me. It sounds unbelievable, but it is what we believe as Christians. And so I hope I can continue to live into that reality and take it more seriously. And books like this honestly help me remember that the Jesus we meet in the pages of Scripture, he's not far from us. He's, right here present with us through his Spirit. My guest today has been Rebecca McLaughlin, apologist, speaker, and author of Confronting Jesus, 9 Encounters with the Hero of the Gospels. Rebecca, thanks for this conversation. It's been really rich and helpful.
Thanks so much, Shane.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Connect with us on social media or find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.